Olá a todos. Hoje nós iremos apresentar uma entrevista que foi gravada nas últimas semanas com o general de brigada do Exército Americano da Força Aérea Robert Spalding. Ele que é autor do livro Stealth War: How China Took Over While America Slept. E também foi estrategista-chefe da China para o Pentágono, diretor executivo de planejamento estratégico do Conselho de Segurança dos Estados Unidos. Também foi Defense Attaché em Beijing e estrategista-chefe da Casa Branca. Por isso a gente foi perguntar para ele sobre o coronavírus, sobre a relação da geopolítica internacional nesse momento. Espero que aproveitem o vídeo.
Economics and politics, and one of our subjects of study, it was foreign investments in Brazil. And China is investing a lot. We know in past weeks, 1.4 billion have been confirmed from CCCC. And the first time that I got you was in Kyle Bass' interview. And I saw the title Stealth War. Oh, I have heard something about that. I have read it, some of, I don't know if you know John Ricketts' books, but I read something about financial war and in 2016. And then I saw Stealth War and I thought, oh, that's that's great. It's going to put it on my article. And I want to thank you because you helped me a lot to understand China in first place. I think you're going to help us a lot, also from my colleagues and other teachers and professors. So I'm very honored that you are here. You let some time of your time, General. That's very great. And I'm hoping that this message to Brazil is very important in this moment of the COVID and the Corona. When we think of China, General, so much story of people that went to China, for example, the investment biker, Jim Rogers. China is fabulous. We go to buildings in China, those 30, 40 floors, and we see Porsches, Maseratis, a lot of those expensive cars. My dad already traveled to Shanghai, Shenzhen, and he said same things. And that's the view that we take. Oh, China is growing more than West. China is growing more than Europe. China is the new capitalist. China is the new player. And you went to China in two different occasions. Tell us something more about these occasions and how you became a China expert. And what differentiates you from other Chinese experts around the globe? What's the difference in your thinking?
So the first time I went to China was actually 2002. And the year before that, I was at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, learning Chinese. Before that, I really didn't know much about China. And the summer of 2000, I thought about applying for this program to go and study in China. And of course, I didn't think I would be accepted, but I put in anyway. And of course, I was selected. And then I went to language training. And then in 2002, I went to China. And so I lived in Shanghai for 2 years, from 2002 to 2004. I studied at Tongji University, mostly MBA classes, learning. It was pretty much the Harvard curriculum, except translated into Chinese. And so I took classes, MBA classes, and traveled all over China for 2 years. And I was there with my family. And, you know, China was growing at the time incredibly fast. In fact, it was said that all the world's cranes were in China, even in Shanghai. Every block was a new skyscraper going up. And it was incredibly exciting. There was all of the Fortune 500 companies were building factories in the Shanghai economic zone. And it was a fantastic experience. And I traveled all over the country with my family. We got to know the language, the culture, the history, the geography of China and the Chinese people. And it was really great. And the people were very friendly. And so that was my first experience living in China. And as I left in 2004, I really wanted to go back. And so I told my wife, you know, when I leave the Air Force eventually, when I retire, then I want to go back and we'll start a business, because it's really a vibrant place. And so I left China in 2004 and went back to the Air Force, and really kind of put that part of my life away, you know, knowing that someday in the future I would go back. Of course, I kept my language. I kept training my language a couple hours a week to keep my Chinese. But for the most part, I didn't have anything to do with China. You know, the United States was very involved with the Middle East, and being a B-2 pilot, most of my time was spent focused on the Middle East. But you know, the Air Force had plans for me to take that experience and use it. And so later on, as I rose in rank to colonel, they told me that, well, we want to send you back to China. And so in order to prepare me to go back to China as the senior defense official, now the position I was going to take was to be the senior U.S. military officer in the country, representing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense. So this is a very prestigious job. And so they wanted me to get some experience before I went in that job. And so the two positions they sent me to prepare for this was, well, first at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. So I spent a year at the council as a senior military fellow, meeting business leaders and financial leaders and investment leaders, and really trying to understand global finance, global trade, economics, and you know, our diplomacy towards China, because really my experience with China had been much more focused on the people, not really the government. And then from there, I went to be the advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And while I was as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I had a team of China experts where we essentially provided advice to the chairman on how we should, what his advice should be to the president with regard to our policy towards China. And so this is the first time that I really start to begin to understand the government and the party. And I read a lot, thousands of pages. I talk to a lot of businessmen. So a lot of the connections I made while I was in New York, I used during this time at the Pentagon to really understand the global finance and global trade and global economics, so that I could advise the chairman on what should be our policy. And so one of the things going on at that time was the islands in the South China Sea. And so we recognized that that was a challenge. They were illegal according to international rules, but of course the Chinese weren't actually obeying the rules. So we were talking about what are the policy options. And so as we were talking about these, a lot of economics and finance and trade was involved in the discussion. And of course, this led to my second time in China, where I was actually the defense attaché and the senior defense official in Beijing. And by this time, I realized that everything that I had learned up until my time in the Pentagon was wrong. My initial impression of China was informed by my interactions with people who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda for their entire lives, and the media and the internet and everything that they came in contact within the closed system of China had, been what they were telling me. It was essentially created to, provide a certain sense of what China is. And so the second time I went to China, I had much more understanding of the government and the regime and the party, and I could see it with eyes that were much more clear. And so at that time, I could really understand the nature of the regime. And when I went back the second time, you could see the oppression. You could see the power of the regime over the people, and you could see also when I had conversations with people, I could see that, there was areas where, for instance, somebody educated in college, a college graduate, should know about their political system, but they had no concept of their political system. So I realized that, I could see then that there was definitely a component of their world that they just had no insight into. And so the second time, by then I realized that the first time I had gone to China, this is the China that the Chinese Communist Party wants me to see. And the second time I was actually able to see, I think, the real China.
Great. And your book, Statofortress, something very important is, as you said, propaganda. Let's go to language. So what is the distinction between CCP, Chinese Communist Party, and Chinese people? Because some persons like think of just China is both things. China is both things. And what you heard in closed doors, in embassies, with the financial elites, about propaganda?
So the Chinese Communist Party is actually quite good at speaking for all Chinese people. In fact, in diplomatic circles, what they'll say often is, "You've offended 1.4 billion Chinese." And so when you understand how most people think, and having lived in China, I did, and you challenge them, the diplomats, and you say, but most Chinese don't care about what you're saying. They don't care about politics. In fact, they're encouraged not to even think about politics. And so, but what happens is diplomats, as they hear this, they believe that they're actually talking to somebody that represents the people. And this is the power of Chinese Communist Party propaganda, because in China, and I didn't understand this until I began to read the documents, but in China, there's two constitutions. Now, you normally think of a country as having one constitution that governs society. In China, there's actually two. There's the People's Republic of China Constitution, and that really represents the government facade. It is a veneer. It is meant to give you the appearance of a sovereign government. But then there's another constitution. It's the Constitution of the Chinese Communist Party. And here is where the power of the nation lies. A sovereign controls things like the banking system, controls the police force, controls the military, controls the borders. These are the things that the sovereign controls. And when you look at the two systems, what you begin to realize is the Chinese Communist Party controls the banking system and the police force and the military and the borders. And you realize that between those two constitutions, there's only one that's actually sovereign for China. And so when you think of the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party, its main goal is not to provide for the citizens of China. It is to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power as the leading power in China. Everything is essentially focused to keeping the Chinese Communist Party in power. And so when you look at that, what you realize when you see those two constitutions and you understand what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, then you realize that in reality, the Chinese Communist Party is taking the Chinese people and portraying itself as representing the Chinese people. But because they don't represent the people, but in fact, they treat the people of China as subjects, almost in like aristocracy, then the people of China, according to the Chinese Communist Party Constitution, have no rights. One example, rule of law. rule of law is a term in a democracy where each citizen has rights and where justice is blind. And so you have a right to you have the right to a fair trial and a due process. In the Chinese Communist Party Constitution, there is no rule of law. The Chinese Communist Party is essentially the law. And how it determines the law is according to its own prerogative. And so until you understand the government, you can't understand propaganda. And the propaganda is really meant to ensure that people are not aware of the true structure of the Chinese political system.
That's great. So CCP is not Chinese people. That's break a lot of people, like experts. Going to economics, something very interesting in your career is that you did a PhD in University of Missouri in economics. 1 year before the market crisis. First question, why did economics? You answered a little bit, but why precise more? And second, Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage and neoclassical didn't solve the question of China. And what is China economic problem? The economic thinking behind that. Which was the economic thinking before Trump trade war?
So I started out, actually, my family was, I come from a farming family. And so I thought I was going to be a farmer growing up. I ended up joining the Air Force because I watched the movie Top Gun.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Those Hornets.
So I thought, well, this would be fun. But so I thought I was going to be a farmer. So I went, my undergraduate and my master's degree were in agricultural economics. And really, agricultural economics is neoclassical microeconomics for the farm. And so my training growing up in university was as an economist, but I always felt like something was missing. And so I went back to get my PhD, and my PhD was actually in economics and mathematics. And the university that I went to is one of the few heterodox economic programs in the United States. And that program actually taught me so much more about the field of economics, because neoclassical economics, as you know, can be quite narrow when you think about the entire economic literature out there. So what I'm referring to is historical economics, development economics, evolutionary economics. So writers, economists like Thorsten Veblen and Clarence Ayres and other disciplines other than neoclassical. I didn't realize that there was such a breadth of economic theory out there about how societies develop, how societies prosper. You know, is economic development based on consumption? Is it based on technological evolution? Is it based on monetary theory? You know, a lot of our economics is really very narrowly defined around models. And what I found is there's a lot of literature out there that really has nothing to do with neoclassical economics. So this was my PhD. And then, of course, a lot of my mathematics was around time series analysis, and really looking at filtering equations for stock variance. My goal was to go to Wall Street and become a financial wizard. So that's where I really had a very interesting
and working
education, because
like that.
It was mathematics, but it was also economics, neoclassical economics, but also a lot of different economic disciplines blended in there. And so what I came to understand is, you know, neoclassical provides one set of tools, but not the total total set of tools. And I think you need a lot of different understandings of economics before you can really make, I think, good choices. And I think, so it comes to what I discovered with regard to China, because what you find is, neoclassical economics will lead you down this path where it says that, because markets are Pareto efficient, that, the fact that we can offshore manufacturing makes, lower prices. But economists, particularly theoretical economists, tend to stop looking there. But if you look at what the empirical economists are looking at, then you can begin to understand that we've been led down this primrose path where, we're basing our decisions on a model, much like we're doing today with regard to coronavirus. We're basing on a model that hasn't been cross-checked with empirical evidence. And so what I began to see in my time in the Pentagon was the empirical evidence was showing that what the theoretical economists were saying about what's the best way we should approach markets with China was fundamentally flawed.
And something that you put in chapter 4 of your book, to China economic aggression or China economic blitzkrieg. In your report that I saw about it was sent to Mr. Trump, assessing and strengthening the manufacturing and defense industrial base and supply chain resilience of the United States. I have listened all my life the United States is the best army in the world. They have those Apaches, they have those Hornets, and like Top Gun, really, like Top Gun. And something that surprised me is that in that report it says China is the sole source of ammunition and missiles. And that shocked me. It's like Great Britain demanding for Bonaparte their guns. It's something very strange. So who in the elites slept while this happened? And how much were the loss in manufacturing industry and others?
So yeah, we lost from 2001 to 2017. America lost over 70,000 factories. We lost over 3 million manufacturing jobs, over 13 million jobs in total. We lost the capability to manufacture microelectronics, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, many of the things that we're missing today for coronavirus, we don't manufacture in the United States. As you mentioned, propellant for Hellfire missiles, you name it, rare earth metals, all of these things that the United States, at one point was very dominant in manufacturing, we essentially moved to China. In fact, I remember talking to this one gentleman telling me about a glass factory in the East Coast of the United States that was taken apart brick by brick and put on a ship and moved to China and reassembled, and glass started being produced in that. So we basically said, we're going to move all of our manufacturing to China because the corporations that did that realized that they could make higher margins on their products. And so part of that challenge there is that the United States, over the course of the 50s and 60s and 70s, realized that, our factories were exploiting labor, they were polluting the environment. And so there was a whole effort to clean up the factories, to make sure that working conditions were good. And then in the 90s or in the 2000s, when China entered the WTO, we basically let all those corporations send those factories to China, where they had no labor laws and no environmental laws. In the People's Republic of China, they would have the laws, but then they wouldn't be enforced. So they would bribe the inspectors for the environmental conditions. They would, when I was living in Shanghai, I heard many stories where the workers would come to collect their pay, and then instead of getting paid, they would be beaten by guards that the factory owners had hired to prevent from having to pay the employees. And of course, in China, unless you have what's called a hukou, which is your the documentation that allows you to work in a certain city, then you can't legally work there. It is almost like being an illegal alien in your own country, because say if you're from Wuhan and you try to go to Shanghai to have a job, then if you don't have a Shanghai hukou, you can't legally work there. And so also the factory owners would exploit that. They would exploit their own citizens because they knew that they were working in that city illegally. So this is how, American elites, corporate leaders essentially exploited Chinese labor, polluted the Chinese environment. And in reality, the US government allowed this because, economists would say, well, this is the best way to run the economy because, markets are Pareto efficient. China is much more economical to manufacture, and therefore, this makes sense. And of course, everybody's getting cheaper prices at Walmart, so of course they support it. What they don't understand is that the people, for instance, in that glass factory that I mentioned, those people who had long-term jobs with health benefits and retirement benefits no longer had jobs. And in fact, they never got jobs. This was what the empirical economists found, that when they looked and surveyed those job losses that I've talked about, that none of those jobs ever transitioned to what was believed to be, better jobs, like white collar jobs. They just didn't go to work. And so they permanently left the job market. And so this was a structural problem in our society that exists till today. And I think when you talk about what is the strategy with the Trump administration, it is to basically fix that structural flaw.
Yeah, and something more about banks, the Fed and Chinese banks. Bannon says that the investment banking industry had become the CCP Investor Relations Department. That's very strong statement. At the same time, China is engaging bilateral trade with their currency and other currencies other than the dollar. And if you take the Fed and its founders like the JP Morgan and Warburg and Rothschilds and those associates, and Citibank also, what is the main difference between this Wall Street debt and equity diplomacy from the administration one, the past administrations? If you had listened without citing source, of course, from the financial elite about this banking diplomacy, about default, they probably going to be defaults, about Chinese banks, about that Ponzi scheme that you call in your book.
Yeah. So what you find in the banking system is that essentially for at least a couple of decades now, the United States has been very focused on, particularly since globalization, very focused on monetary policy as the means to get out of economic crises. And so they essentially flood the banking system with money. And what the Chinese Communist Party has figured out is they can take advantage of that, quantitative easing and all the money in the system by incentivizing both corporate America and Wall Street to make sure that money flows into China. And so it flows into China through American depository receipts in Hong Kong. So this is the special sauce, if you will, the secret weapon, because we treat Hong Kong differently than we do the mainland China. Yeah. Since mainland China doesn't have a convertible currency and they have strict capital controls, Hong Kong is actually the window that American financial markets actually do business with China. And so you can, as a Chinese company, through American depository receipts in Hong Kong, sell your, shares on U.S. capital markets. Now, the problem is that in the United States, we allow this to happen without requiring those companies to go through the same audit and transparency requirements of U.S. corporations. And so they have an advantage in that they're not required to file 10Ks and 10Qs like a U.S. corporation or other, corporations from developed economies. And so this is based on the idea that China has a developing economy according to the WTO, but the requirements for a developing economy, China already surpasses those in terms of income at the WTO, but yet they're still classified as a developing economy. So they're able to use the equity markets to get money from the United States, particularly institutional investors. And then in the bond markets, it's the same thing. They're able to sell their bonds in the United States. And in fact, there's been numerous times where Chinese equities and companies have essentially been fraudulent. And they're fraudulent, and we find out later because they're keeping false books, they're fake books. And so this continues. This policy continues until today. And so when we have a financial crisis like 2008 or today with the coronavirus, what you see is as money gets put into the financial system, that money is lent via loans or bonds to Chinese companies that then build, in China, these empty cities, ghost cities that really have, I think, 68 million vacant apartments in China that could not be filled with the entire population of the United States. But because the Chinese Communist Party uses this capital to maintain employment, then they just continue to use it by building infrastructure and building real estate. Now, they're also doing this on the Belt and Road Initiative. And what I suspect you're going to find is once the United States begins to cut off the flow of capital to China for this reason, then you're going to see a lot of those things dry up. But that's what's happened. And I think you're going to see many of those banks that have loaned money to China are going to have to take a write down in their balance sheets because they're not getting that money back. This is a Ponzi scheme that we're talking about. It really just continues to throw money after bad money, which is never coming back.
We are out of time, but I need to ask you, can you answer one or two more questions or not?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, it's about 5G and then enter more direct in COVID and forecast. The last week here in Brazil, the Cabinet of Institutional Security didn't impose any vetoes from competitors in the auction about 5G. So Huawei is competing with Qualcomm also. We see that Beno had made a film, The Claws of the Red Dragon, recently, in order to expose the CCP in Huawei. What is the relation within worldwide Chinese companies, so agriculture, business, energy, power plant, and CCP? What is 5G? What real is 5G? And who runs Huawei?
So first of all, the Chinese Communist Party, because they're sovereign and because of the type of system and regime that they have, they really control everything in the country. They control the banks, they control the police, they control the military, they control the bank, or they control the businesses, the corporations. So they really control everything. And so, whether you're what's called a state-owned enterprise or a private company, the Chinese Communist Party controls everything. And they have Chinese Communist Party members that are often in private sector businesses. You may not know that. One good example is Alibaba. So I don't know if you remember, but Alibaba was run by Jack Ma. He's the founder and CEO. Of course, he revealed that he was a member of the Communist Party, unbeknownst to everybody. So what you realize is in China, everything is controlled by the Communist Party. It is very much like the mafia, if you think of that kind of organization. Now, how does that interface with Huawei? Well, you have to go back to 2007. In 2007, Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone. In 2007, the top 5 companies in market capitalization in the United States were AT&T, General Electric, Microsoft, ExxonMobil, and Shell. We essentially had an industrial economy. Now, when you take that smartphone, which is a platform for the apps, services, and business models of the e-economy or the information economy, and the United States begins building in 2009 4G networks, then you see the rise in 10 years of Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, as the top companies in market capitalization, still including Microsoft. And essentially what you have in 10 years from 2007 to 2017 is a transition from an industrial economy to an information economy. And really those companies, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, and Microsoft, dominating the global economy. So powerful are those companies that the EU creates global data protection regulation to begin to protect the privacy of its citizens. Because what Silicon Valley has done with the mobile platform and the 4G network is really build an enormous capacity to process data using machine learning algorithms to determine, essentially what your interests are in terms of consumption. And so they turn that data into information in order to influence your consumption patterns. Now, the Chinese Communist Party saw this and realized the power of data and began in roughly 2010 to say, 2009, 2010 to say, we want to dominate the next version of computing and networking, and that is 5G. So today in 4G, the apps are built on top of the mobile platform. And so you take out your smartphone and you open an application like Uber and you ask for a car. But 5G is really about the connectivity and the computing in the network. And so today, 4G networks have 10,000 devices per square mile, where 5G networks allow 3 million devices per square mile, because they're taking the apps away from the smartphone and they're actually putting it on the 5G network itself. Because instead of opening an app on your smartphone, what you will do is you'll walk outside, you'll say Uber, and a camera will pick up your face. Facial recognition algorithms will recognize you. They'll read your lips, or a microphone will pick up your voice and they will send a car, most likely without a driver. All of that data is what is valuable. So in the 4G world, the telcos, the ones that built the networks in the United States, it's AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and Sprint. They spent $250 billion building the networks, but then Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google came and took the data and took all the value out of the system. So the value is really in the data, because the data is the fuel for artificial intelligence. And Kai-Fu Lee, who is the leading artificial intelligence researcher for China, says that China wants to be the Saudi Arabia of data. So in the United States, we have a free market. And it is not the case that we can take money from Facebook, Amazon, and Google and give it to AT&T to build a 5G network. That is not the way our system works. But in China, since the Chinese Communist Party controls everything, it can take money from Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent and use it to subsidize Huawei to build a 5G network. So this is what they're doing. Essentially, they're subsidizing Huawei and ZTE to build the networks because they want to give the data to Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. So the goal is, just like the United States dominated the global e-economy in 4G, China wants to dominate the global e-economy in 5G, and those companies are going to be Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. In order to do that, China wants to dominate 5G. So not only do they dominate it through Huawei, if you're using Ericsson or Samsung or Nokia, because they're all building the same network, because they all come together in the industry standard making body 3GPP, they are all designing the same network. And so in actuality, what the Chinese have built is an ecosystem that allows them to get the data that will drive their artificial intelligence into the future for economic dominance. But more importantly, and this is a crucial thing for democracies, because you can use, as demonstrated in the 2016 elections in the United States or recently in the Taiwan elections, artificial intelligence bots, social media networks, and big data, you can actually individually influence people in democracies using those same tools. And that's what these regimes like Russia and China are getting better and better at. So they're taking the tools, the technologies, and the business models of Silicon Valley, and they're turning them into tools for deploying authoritarianism outside their borders. And it's actually quite effective.
That's great. And last question, I promise. So COVID-19 or Chinese virus or CCP virus, as someone calls, like when you give an interview in Epoch, is already spread around the world. Some chief of states are already saying that they're going to retaliate to China, their negligence. What's your geopolitical assessment about the situation? Who will win more, China or the West? And what can China really gain in this situation by the American industry and by making a confusion in national politics?
So if you go back to the timeline, actually the first cases of the coronavirus occurred in November. And in December, all throughout December, the infections are accelerating in China and getting more and more. And they are starting, the doctors in Wuhan are starting to really get frightened, and they start telling their colleagues, we've got a problem. And then, and they do that on WeChat, a social media platform. And of course, the police in Wuhan detain them and tell them to be quiet. They had actually taken some tissue samples. Those were destroyed. Finally, in the very end of December, they tell the WHO, we have a couple of flu, people that have flu. They don't tell them that there's human-to-human transmission. In fact, they don't tell them about human-to-human transmission. Then what happens? In January, New Year's for China, all the people come back to Wuhan. And so now the infections are accelerating, and they have, the New Year's, and there's a lot of celebrations, and they have one like 40,000 people, feast where they bring their food and they're all mingling. And now the infections are exploding in Wuhan, and 5 million people leave New Year's in Wuhan and go all around the world. They go to Italy, they go to New York, they go to San Francisco, literally all around in China, all around the world, and they take the virus. All of this occurred because the Chinese Communist Party hid what was happening from the world. And so this is what a totalitarian regime does. They essentially are worried about their own image. They want to make sure that there's no, they wanted to make sure that they could continue to have airlines coming into China, that they could continue to have travel coming into China, that they could continue to keep their economy going. And so they suppress this and actually let the virus get out. And so what we have now is within the United States, the Centers for Disease Control have been clearly wrong about how bad the disease was, how many people were going to be affected, what's the best way to treat it. And the reason that is because we had none of the data, because the Chinese Communist Party not only would not give us the data, they wouldn't let our researchers in there to actually, find out for themselves. So we have had to learn on our own, as I suspect that most nations in the world are having to learn on their own how to deal with the virus. I know that the State Department is having regular conversations with our allies and partners around the world, trying to compare notes, to share information, to make sure. And this is, by the way, this is how it should be. We should be working together to fight a global pandemic. But make no mistake, this pandemic was started by the Chinese Communist Party. It is probably the first global pandemic that was started by a regime, because of the nature of the regime is secrecy and obfuscation. And so this is a challenge that we have now. And I think what it's done for the United States is made us wake up and realize we can't trust them. We cannot trust them for health. We can't trust them for manufacturing. We can't trust them for financial data. We can't trust them for everything. And so for anything. So this is what's going to happen, I think, after this coronavirus clears, is there's going to be a complete restructuring of the relationship between the United States and China. No longer are we going to be dependent on them for manufacturing. No longer are we going to be dependent on them for anything, because we can't trust them, and it's up to us. And so what I think the Trump administration is seeking to do is work with other democracies, because democracies are transparent. Democracies are responsive to their citizens. Democracies can't get away with hiding information, because they have a population with a free press. And these are the things that are so important when facing a global pandemic. So I think it's terrible, and thousands of people will end up dying because of this. But it's also the silver lining in the cloud is that we know that we've been deceived by globalization and the internet, particularly as we've allowed these totalitarian regimes to be a part. And now we're going to make it different going forward. So I think going forward, you'll see America focus on data security, manufacturing, infrastructure, science and technology, STEM education, and working with democracies to protect our borders, to protect our people, to ensure that, we're the elements of the international order, democratic principles, free trade, rule of law, self-determination, human rights, civil liberties. All of these things are things that we should be collectively promoting in the international system.
General Robert, thank you a lot. Thank you once more. Great time with you. Is a lot of better than the book. You've seen you a lot, seeing you there. So I'm also thanking for my colleagues this interview, and I have one question, not about China, but can I publish this on college social media also?
Yes, absolutely, sure.
Because I think we need to spread this message.
Yes, absolutely. And someday maybe I can come down to Brazil and say hello.
That would be great.
Yeah,
that would be great.
So thank you so much. It was really good talking to you and getting to meet you.
Also, it's a pleasure. A pleasure.
Thank you.